COVID-19 pandemic is pressing American global strategy to reconsider options in military deployments with respect to Iran, China, and Russia and other countries. But the pandemic is not fundamentally changing the new approach of great power competition, which has been defined as strategic predictability and operational unpredictability. However, I do think, as the first speaker stated, that we are into a new situation. We're going to be facing a $4 trillion deficit, and this is going to considerably force the US to reconsider both its defense spending that was talked about earlier, as well as its strategy. And what I want to do today is talk a little bit about optional alternative strategies that we can foresee, or hopefully discuss anyway, in the coming era as the United States begins to meet the economic crisis, the global economic crisis. Rather than seeking a diplomatic approach that would bring all states together in the struggle against an invisible enemy and seek to resolve their political military disputes, the US, China, Russia, and Iran have all been propagandizing against them. And the WHO, for example, has been in the crossfire between the US and China, as just discussed. Probably the most immediate impact of the coronavirus was on Trump's maximum pressure strategy on Iran. Here, the US Theodore Roosevelt incident, in which Captain Crozier was removed from his command for writing a letter in which he demanded resources from higher authorities that would have permitted him to move his crew on shore in order to save them from the spread of the coronavirus, directly impacted Trump's maximum pressure strategy on Iran, and it likewise concurrently exposed problems in the naval bureaucracy and Trump's own administrative disarray. Crozier's letter stated that the US was not at war, sailors do not need to die. Nevertheless, Crozier's demand to disembark the crew forced the US Navy to redeploy a second aircraft carrier, the US Harry Truman, out of the Arab-Persian Gulf region and towards the Pacific. So this incident had at least a minimum effect on Trump's maximum pressure strategy, and Trump had to compensate for that by later saying that he would fire upon Iranian vessels that have been engaged in what's called swarming techniques against US warships. But the main point here is that the Trump administration's failed miserably to change Iranian behavior after Trump dumped the nuclear Iran accord set up by Obama, the JCPOA. Tehran has continued to push ahead on its nuclear enrichment program, and it just tested a new military satellite. The Trump administration had hoped to augment international pressures on the Iranian regime and prevent Iran from importing small arms at a time when Russia, Turkey, Turkey and India are all impacted by US sanctions on Iran, and they're not playing along with the US sanctions policy. In an effort to obtain international support, Trump ironically wants to claim that the US still belongs to the JCPOA. Now, this is very complicated, but it's very ironic that he's bringing this back. But let me just quote the Arms Control Association, who said, if the Trump administration is successful in bringing back UN sanctions, the JCPOA Iran nuclear deal will likely collapse, which will trigger a new nuclear crisis. Now, I think we have to think about alternatives here. Let me just point out a few alternatives, which I think perhaps a new administration or a second-term Trump administration, if he does win, because I'm not convinced he might win again, is to return to the 2015 JCPOA nuclear deal and to negotiate a follow-on nuclear agreement that builds upon that deal. And this time, US needs to push for the missile technology control regime for the Middle East and prevent an all-out destabilizing arms transfers, to the states in the Middle East. Most importantly, US needs to encourage Iran-Saudi negotiations to put an end to their proxy wars in Yemen, Iraq, and Syria. And finally, all states in the region and the world could pledge a no first use of any kind of weapon of mass destruction. I think these are goals that could be could be applied in the near future. But here's the point. Even if the US or Israel do not go to war with Iran as they have threatened, if Iran continues to develop an offensive missile capability and possibly a nuclear weapons capability, Trump's maximum pressure strategy risks the dangerous destabilization of Iraq and Iran. Iraq is already becoming a battlefield for the US and Iran, as the killing of General Quds Commander Soleimani showed. And the collapse of energy prices, which hasn't mentioned here, will further destabilize both Iraq and Syria, by the way, opening up the door to Daesh, Islamic State, and also new other possible Iraqi groups will arise, or other terrorist organizations. And even Daesh had said the COVID virus provides them a new opportunity against the Crusader states. Now, ironically, the Theodore Roosevelt affair may have provided the Trump administration with a way to shift its focus towards China, while at the same time seeking to pressure Iran in other ways besides vulnerable aircraft carriers. The irony here is there's an increasing danger that the US aircraft carriers could be vulnerable to Iranian attack in the Strait of Hormuz. And on the other hand, the strategic focus on Iran has drawn the Trump administration away from its feared threat posed by China. Now here, as stated by General Joseph Votel in the House Armed Services Committee in February 2018, the Trump administration has feared that Tehran's eventual membership in the Chinese-led Shanghai Cooperation Organization would strengthen Iran's economic military capabilities. In effect, Iranian membership in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization would represent a keystone that would solidify a Russia-China axis in Eurasia and throughout the wider Middle East as a threat to Israeli, Saudi, and US global interests. It would also, at the same time, China hopes to expand its hegemony in the South and East China Seas. Here's a point that's not brought out, I think, in the press. US maximum pressure strategy on Iran is intended to disrupt China's Bridge and Road Initiative and to break a burgeoning Sino-Russian alliance with Iran that is likewise trying to bring in states such as Turkey. We see Turkey flirting between Russia and NATO, Pakistan increasingly caught in the Bridge and Road Initiative with China, and even the Philippines, former US ally that is playing between the US and China now. So in addition to expanding its Bridge and Road Initiative, Beijing, in forging a closer alliance with Russia and potentially Iran, has hoped to establish a Chinese version of the US Monroe Doctrine in the East and South China Seas, in rivalry with the regional ASEAN powers. At the same time, it's threatening to unify with Taiwan by force, as stated by President for Life Xi Jinping in January 2019. Now, just recently, as a proof of the tensions that are ongoing, despite the coronavirus, the US Navy just engaged in another freedom of navigation operation in the Spratly Islands. Now, with respect to Russia, US and NATO have been engaging in a new military confrontation in Eastern Europe ever since the preclusive Russian annexation of Crimea and the political military interference in Eastern Ukraine, with military buildups in Kaliningrad and the Baltic Sea region, Crimea and the Black Sea region, and Syria and the Eastern Mediterranean. This is coupled with Moscow's energy card designed to draw states closer to Russian interests, including Turkey and even Germany with its Nord Stream project. In response to alleged Russian violations of the INF treaty, the United States dropped out of the INF treaty and could soon drop out of New START, therefore removing all the significant arms control pacts that we've engaged in since the Cold War and after. And furthermore, these actions threaten to tear apart the 1997 NATO-Russia Founding Act. Furthermore, the US and Russia and China are all engaged in a new arms race to develop hypersonic weaponry while deploying low-yield nuclear weapons on both tactical and long-range missile systems. This emphasis on tactical nuclear weapons and low-yield warheads, to my mind, indicates a move to develop an actual nuclear warfighting capability. In January 2008, in the National Defense Strategy, the US began to focus on great power competition with China and Russia, downplaying to some extent the global war on terrorism. The irony is that this strategy is pushing China, Russia, and Iran closer together so that their mutual interests outweigh their differences, and is concurrently unsettling US allies who cannot be certain if the US will come to their defenses. Here's just an example of that. The Trump administration just recently pulled out its heavy B-52 bombers, plus its B-1 and B-2 stealth bombers from Guam in order to reduce potential targets for China's so-called Guam killer missile and North Korea's missiles as well. But the problem is the US is deploying its bombers more randomly. It's argued that the United States can retract to the US mainland, deploy bases and deploy these weapons, these bombers from North Dakota and Louisiana. But then again, these deployments are farther away, and it takes longer for the US to bring these bombers to the areas in Asia where they might be deployed. And finally, the federal deficit is to approach $4 trillion, which will increase US demands for significant decreases in defense spending. Finally, my last point is what is needed is a new strategy, new diplomatic strategy that seeks to split the burgeoning alliance between Russia and China, and that draws Russia closer to the United States and the European Union, while concurrently seeking a concerted US, European, Russian strategy that seeks to channel China's rise to hegemonic status. At the same time, the US, China, and Taiwan need to forge a new arrangement that builds upon the Taiwan Relations Act through the establishment of joint US-China international security guarantees for Taiwan and involving US-Chinese security cooperation and joint regional development projects in the South and East China Seas. To accomplish this means a totally new strategy in which the US needs to engage in a rapprochement, US and NATO need to engage in a rapprochement with Russia, and we begin to reduce this military buildup that I've just mentioned in Eastern Europe, in Crimea, and in the Baltic region, and likewise begin an rapprochement with China. So the irony, contrary to the Cold War strategy, which containment was ironically designed to push Russia and China together to keep them divided, this strategy seeks out a rapprochement with both Russia and China almost simultaneously. Once again, there will be no lasting settlement until the US, EU, and Russia begin to seek out a general entente. The US, EU, and Russia seek out a general entente while likewise engaging in dialogue to channel China's hegemonic ambitions. So I'll end right there. I know that's a lot of material, but I can discuss it if there's any questions after.